John 12, 1 through 11. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it at Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as keeper of the money, he used to help himself to what was put into the money bag. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there, and they came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him.
So I have a question I want to start with today. What kind of behavior, legal, keep it in the legal realm, what kind of behavior would you consider dangerous? Dangerous. We all probably have a different list. I don't do well with heights. If I come to the edge of the stage, I get nervous, so I put my hand here. Not because I'm leaning on this, it's because I get a vertigo thing that just kind of goes, and the next thing I know, I'm kind of like feeling like I'm going to fall. So I don't like heights. So anyone that has ever jumped off of a bridge, like one of those bungee jumpers, I personally think you've moderately lost your mind. It's dangerous. And Saturday night folks, I didn't know so many of our Saturday night folks were risky livers. They are. A number of them came up to me. Oh, let me show you a picture of the time that I bungee jumped. And one fellow, who I will leave unnamed, that I love, but last night I could have just punched him. He gave me his phone and says, watch this. And he bungee jumped and videoed the whole thing going down to the ground. And I was just like, get away from me, Satan. I hated that thing. I am scared of heights. And so I have never in my life been on a plane that I thought I'd be better off jumping off of it. It's dangerous. I think I grew up, around rodeos a little bit. And so I think these guys, they're a different breed of crazy. Bull riders, you got it. Those guys that get on 1,500-pound, really furious bulls. Now, I don't know this at all. In fact, the bulls that we had at the fairgrounds, they kept them fine. But sometimes I think they, put a prod in them and don't feed them for a couple of days just to tick them off. And people get on this thing and go for 8 seconds. I think I would just tell the bull, you win. Jump off in the chute and say, hey, you won. That would be dangerous to me. My guess is if we put all of our lists together, we'd have a lot of overlap. You'd have some that I wouldn't have, and I might have a few that you don't have. Probably none of us would put on that list going to church. Now, I know there's people out there, that are down on church. I get that. Yeah, they don't want to go to church. It's this. But would they say it's dangerous? Very few. Would people say worshiping God can be dangerous? You wouldn't until you come to this story. And this story is a marvelous contrast between a woman who is moved by God to live in a virtually scandalous way. Contrasting it to a man who got sucked into the danger of dishonest, calculated, pragmatic, and thoughtless worship. I go to a lot of worship services, on average 3 a week. I worship at home. I worship in the truck. I've never considered worship a danger like riding a bull. But this passage has changed my list. Worship can be dangerous. In fact, it can far exceed that of bull riding. Mary walks into the room. It's a house. It's in Bethany. They don't identify the house. We can guess. Probably doesn't matter. Martha's doing her normal thing. I like Martha. Because of Martha, people eat. And there's all these people sitting around the table. Lazarus, it says, is there. Jesus is there. What is the honor? It's the honor of Christ. That's what they were doing. They're throwing a party for Jesus. It would have been a dinner that women wouldn't be invited to, kind of a, cultural thing. And as they're gathered around, Martha's happily serving, and Mary, she brings out this perfume. They tell us in the text that it's a year's wages. So to move it into your world, the average wage here in Salem is going to be what, 50, 60,000? Some of you are going, I want average. Some of you are going, man, I praise God, I'm way above average. Kudos. She brings in a jar of perfume, 50,000 worth, and she pours it on the feet of Jesus, unannounced and absolutely uninvited. Martha's probably grabbing her, her dress or something, trying to get, Mary, get back in here. What do you think you're doing? That's our inheritance. That's the only way we're going to live. You're a crazy woman. Get in here. And Mary walks in. Now, that would be scandalous enough, to be honest with you. Just the very thing of going and kneeling at Jesus' feet. All eating stopped. For 3 or 4 of them, all breathing stopped. And they just looked at her. And if pouring all of that perfume on his feet wasn't enough, she reaches back and she pulls her hair. A servant wouldn't have done that. A servant would have grabbed a towel, would have grabbed an apron, maybe part of the dress, but never her hair. She washes his feet, tears coming down her eyes. Jesus strangely looked as comfortable as he's ever been. Didn't flinch, didn't say, Mary, get away from here. Mary, do you know what you're doing? Mary, we can do this later. Eyes were fiery at Christ, but at Mary. It was supposed to be a dinner. It turned into a worship service. That can happen. Wasn't the temple, wasn't church. They didn't set out to have a worship service. They just ended up there. On one, you have this beautiful, genuine, honest, fully theologically informed woman. Contrasted to this dangerous man. What made his worship dangerous? Number of things. I'll give you 3. It's an article that was written years and years ago by Robert Weber on worship. He's a long-standing writer. And an article probably no less than 30 years ago. He gave 3 words, and I want to use those words and expand on them. Because I think he identified, and I can't do better with these is he identified that one of the things that made Judas's worship dangerous is the dishonesty of it. What is dishonesty? It's putting on a mask. It's coming into the worship service, putting on the mask, trying to give people what they expect. In other words, trying to fulfill cultural expectations. Not asking what the genuineness of the heart is, but what do people expect? And we have certain expectations. We do, and they did. And they had an expectation that, number one, at this table, number one's going to be men. Number two is when you worship, you don't pour $50,000 onto a person's feet. And Judas, it says, was disgusted. And always being the man to play the room, he stands up and he says, "Oh, dear Lord, what about the poor? Should we not care for the poor?" As if that guy has given 1 minute of thought to the poor. But why did he say that? It's because that will play in the crowd. It plays in a lot of crowds. What about the poor? What about those who need? What about this? What about the widows? What about all the things? And he brought up all the things that would somehow raise this shame culture to say, "Oh my goodness, Mary, how horrible of you." He was dishonest at every level. A pint of nard should never be used to express your love for the Lord. It should be used functionally. It should be kind of this utilitarian gift. It should make a difference. We at least should get a wing in the church off of the deal. But to worship God, $50,000. Can you imagine what we could do with $50,000? He didn't care about that. His entire life was a mask. It was an expression of his disgust. And because of that, he was nothing but a thief, masquerading as a man thinking or projecting to be concerned about the poor. What's dangerous worship? It's the kind of worship that is dishonest. It projects one thing because that projection is something that we think culturally will be accepted. We have that. We do. We have certain cultural expectations. You know, when you stand up, okay, you can stand up, raise your hands, maybe 1, not 2. It's a little overboard. And by the way, you have a seat, use it, stay in your lane, don't get out. In the aisle, that's not where you worship in our church, right? Y'all signed that contract? I know that because a number of years ago, Carrie and I, we were in a church and we were leading worship, and she and I were singing, and this lovely lady whom I know and we still have a relationship with, she's a wonderful gal, she just like breaks out and dance right down there. Now, quite honestly, I was doing everything I could. I was standing over here. I think Carrie was over there. And I was standing there trying to keep the rhythm going. And I noticed I was losing everybody. They'd quit singing because we went outside of Baptist protocol. And they were all kind of just looking at her, and she was in her own world and so gloriously oblivious to everyone that had stopped singing. Not me. I was like, Gloria, knock it off. We all have it. We do. We have this expectation, and sometimes when people step outside of that, our interest is not their heart, but our interest is, Lord, what about the poor? What about the wing that we want to build onto the church? What about the children's ministry? Oh God, there's way better things we can do with $50,000. God forbid that somebody would come and simply give $50,000 to say, I want Christ honored. You see, if you don't understand the motive then you misinterpret the worship. If your interest is merely at the perception of what people think, you miss the motive. Most of you know Carrie and I have a daughter with Downs. A number of years ago, I was in a restaurant, and we had eaten breakfast, and I noticed there was a little Downs boy. It catches my attention. I can spot them anywhere. Anyone who has a Downs kid can. And he was bussing tables. I called the waitress over, and I said to her, I said, "Ma'am, is there any way that I can tip that bus boy?" She goes, "Oh, we share our tips." I said, "You do?" I said, "Can you make sure he busts this table?" And so I left a tip. Now, I don't normally have cash. I have no idea. My wallet is unable to keep cash in it. People all the time say, "Oh, I don't want to go to a cashless society." I've been there for 30 years. I'm always cashless. I don't have money. But that day I did. It was almost like God was planning it. And I looked into it. Kid you not, I looked into my wallet. I was traveling, and there was a $100 bill in there. And I did not think once. And don't think I'm Mr. Generous tither or giver. I tip like everybody else, 4%. Don't worry about it. Got to keep them begging for more. I laid out that $100, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't think once about it. I didn't think about it. It was like if I would have had a $500 bill, I would have put it down. And I walked away. And I watched this little boy come up there. I don't think he'd ever seen a $100 bill, and he looked down at that, and he wouldn't touch it. It was almost like it was going to bite him. And he cleaned all the way around it, and he was supposed to pick it up, and he didn't. And he waved his waitress over, pointed at it. She told him, "Pick it up." She looked at me at the door. I wasn't giving just to him. I was giving to my daughter. I was giving to the 90% of Downs kids that when they become adults don't work. The 90% of kids with autism that don't work. That this young man was achieving something that 90% of his peers don't do. And if you don't understand by heart, you look at like $100 tip, who deserves that? He does. $50,000 to Jesus' feet, who does that? A woman who knows who Jesus is. See, dishonest worship is the kind of worship where we come in and we judge people's behaviors based upon our expectation, our cultural expectation. And we determine basically by the perception of what we see. Sometimes if you go to Latin countries, you're going to recognize the Latin countries have no rules about staying in your chairs. They just worship and they all dance. And interestingly enough, sometimes people come back and they'll come back to our church or they'll come back to an American church and they go, "Oh, the American churches are so dead." Why? Well, because they dance down there. Well, great. Maybe it's just a cultural expression. And I'm not trying to be against them. Because if you go to Asian churches, when they pray, the pastor doesn't pray. He prays, but everyone out there prays. And sometimes we look at those things and we come to conclusions, oh, Latin churches are so inspired, they're spirit-filled, and they probably are. But that doesn't mean that the liturgical service that may be more proper is not still filled with the glory of Christ in their heart. You see, dishonest worship is that willingness to make the judgment of my perceived expectation without knowing the heart of a person. If you don't know my heart, then you would really think, man, Mark, you are one big tipper. I'm not. But when I see a Downs kid, I'll start throwing credit cards. And when Mary saw Jesus, $50,000 was nothing. The danger is in dishonest worship. And the danger, secondly, is in what I would call pragmatic or calculated worship. It's that worship that has an end in mind. Like the Latins who say quid pro quo, that this for that. I'll do this if God does that. And that's the world that Judas lived in. Verse 6 tells us that. He says he did not say this about the poor because he cared about them, but because he was what? He was a thief. And every time Jesus took an offering, every time somebody took an offering, he was like, let's take an offering. Let's worship God. Why? Because I'm going to take some money on the side. And what his real anger at Mary is, you know what? If you could just give your nard properly, then I would benefit. We can reduce worship that way. We can be very pragmatic about worship. We can describe it being contemporary or traditional, and then we can get into the competitiveness of what sells and what grows churches. We did that years ago with preaching. In the 80s, church growth was like every pastor was going to church growth conferences, and church growth conferences had a tendency to lead towards what they call relative preaching or relevant preaching. And people, even conferences on relevant expositional preaching, as if the Bible's not relevant. It all is. But that passion to meet the personal needs of people moved us into what some, and I think it's rightly diagnosed or identified as therapeutic deism. It's preaching towards the what? The therapeutic needs of the person. Well, of course, we don't want to preach to nothing. We want to meet people's needs. But when the passion becomes pragmatically reducing ourselves to what? What causes church growth? What can we do to get this place on fire? What can we do to move ourselves up the evangelical food chain? When we do that, we turn into just people like Judas, who when they come to God, I'll follow you if I get part of the treasury. I'll serve you if there's a benefit for me. And sometimes we can come to church and we can, how was church today? Oh, it was great. What made it great? Oh, the songs were perfect. It just moved, and the pastor finally preached a message that I could understand. And we reduce ourselves to preaching not for the glory of God, to not come and bow, but to get a product, to grow a church, to be competitive in the market. Donald Blesh makes this statement, and it's true: proper self-concern is not excluded from the worship experience, but it is always subordinated to the glory of God and to the wonder of his love. What's dangerous worship? It's when you flip that. When our narcissism moves ahead of the glory of God and our demand to have something that we like, that feels good, begins to supersede that of the glory of God. When our quid pro quo sets in and we have an expectation, I will do this, God, if you do that. I will worship you if you fix my marriage. I will worship you if you keep my kids alive. I will worship you if you grow my church. I will worship you if it's pragmatic. It's dangerous. And it leads us to our last one, thoughtless. Mary might have actually been the only person in the room that got it. I think she was. The other disciples caught her later. They caught up with her. They kind of discovered what she knew here. But in this room, I think other than Jesus, she was the only one that had a clue what was happening. Jesus comes back to them. They're having just a complete hissy fit. And he says in verse 7, leave her alone. My guess is he had to say that because they were probably trying to grab her and say, Mary, get out of here. And Mary, what are you doing? And Martha was probably trying to slip in there, dropping off the beans and grabbing, Mary's ankle or something. And it was just a nut house. And Jesus finally, and I can almost hear him say, leave her alone. Stop it. Why? It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You read between the lines. But she couldn't wait. She didn't want to wait till I was dead. She wanted to tell me how much she loved me when I was alive. Mark gives us a picture into that, and I think he adds a little of the nuance to kind of support the direction that Jesus is going in the Gospel of Mark, where it tells the same story. I'm in chapter 14, verse 8. It says, she did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. You see, I think Mary's the only one who understood. She's the only one who understood. Not only did this man raise my brother from the dead, but this man is going to die for me. This man is going to go to the cross, and he's going to take my sins upon him, and he is going to die so that I might be in heaven with him. She's the only one. She's the only theologian in the room. She's the only one that could tell you a correct Christology. She's the only one that could talk to you about the atoning work of Christ's blood. How tempting we are to worship because I like the rhythm, because I like the era of when the music was written, because it's my heart language. There's 1,000 reasons why we like what we like. But dangerous worship is when we place those likes above that which is true, that which is right, that which is lovely, that which is of good repute, that which is praiseworthy. Mary, she worshiped out of what was true. John Ortberg says there's a couple of different kinds of worship. One is scarecrow worship. It's shallow, as if it doesn't have a brain. It lacks content. And yet, on the other hand, he says there's also worship like the 10 men that's missing its heart. And we can judge, and I've been a pastor for almost 40 years, and I've probably pastored my entire life in what I would classify as worship wars. And honestly, so much of it is simply personal preference being driven as some theological position. What about the poor? What about history? What about contemporary? And we bring up all of these things. But Jesus brings forth Mary. And he says, look at my daughter, Mary. She throws caution to the wind. She risks her entire life's reputation and her entire retirement simply to tell Jesus how she feels about it. I don't want to wait till you're buried, Lord. I want to tell you today, I love you. Thank you for saving me. Calculated, pragmatic? No. Impulsive? Yes. Stirred by emotion? Absolutely. In the moment? Yes. Risky? Beyond imagination. But thoughtful? Oh yeah. I think she's the only theologian in the room. She's the only one who, when she looked at Jesus, understood, you are my Christ, my Lord, my Redeemer. I started us off with a question. What kind of behavior is dangerous to you? I wouldn't want to ride a bull. You'll have to drug me beyond imagination for me to ever jump off of some bridge on with some piece of rubber band. If I wasn't a full gospel preacher, I might think of it, but I am full. I'm not jumping. I'm going to stay in every plane I fly in. But you know what's really dangerous for me? On average, I go to 3 worship services every week. And there are days that I'm tempted to wonder, I wonder how they're going to feel about the volume today. I wonder how many notes I'll get on Monday. And in that moment, I've taken a step down the dangerous path of a worship that is driven by the expectations of people than the genuineness of my heart. Every week, I too am tempted. I like that song. Well, there's a line in that song that's probably filled with heresy, but I really like the song. It's got a nice rhythm. And I'm tempted to walk down that path. Why is it dangerous? A few days after this incident, Judas, who was very concerned about the poor, exchanged his friend Jesus Christ for 30 shekels. And my friends, you can do the same thing. You and I, if we start walking down that path of dangerous worship, and if God doesn't perform the way we want, and if God brings us into a mystery, and God walks us down this valley of the shadow of death, and it's not a do this for that, the Lord just says, come follow me, take up your cross. If I have conditioned my heart to a worship that is dependent upon God acting correctly, you know why worship can be dangerous? It's because I can sell out Jesus for 30 shekels just like Judas. And so can you. That's why, my friends, Mary is our model. It is an honest, intimate, raw, unplanned, genuine response to the glory of God. And if you happen to step outside of your seat, so be it. Don't be moved. Don't be moved because you're trying to be like somebody else. But if you're moved genuinely and you fall on your face because you're just taken by the glory of God, I will be there and defend you. Because dangerous worship is dangerous. Let's bow.